So, welcome along to our first podcast. This is one of a series that we're going to be publishing from the Small Supports Programme at NDTI this autumn. And it's kind of fitting that we're starting where Small Supports started. They weren't known as Small Supports back then, but it's really great to have Simon Duffy join us and share a little about the roots of what we now call Small Supports. Simon, along with a few fellow radicals, John Dalrymple, Francis Brown, Sam Smith, Doreen Kelly, to name a few, set out to close down the Lennox Castle long stay institution for people with learning disabilities back in the 1990s. The work to close Lennox Castle could be said to be one of those moments where a number of people and things come together and prove transformational. Today, we're going to speak about the solutions developed to support people with complicated and very individual support needs. More widely, though, closing Lennox Castle spurned all sorts of developments that now find their way into policy across the UK. Self-directed support, for example, is, well, to my knowledge, has its roots in the closure of Lennox Castle. Anyway, welcome, Simon.
Hi, Nick. Lovely to see you.
Why Back to the Future? Well, Back to the Future, Small Supports is the current, but we're looking back at their origin, thinking about the lessons that we've learned since then, and then starting maybe to look ahead, with so much attention being put on local communities, neighbourhoods, and supporting local communities to take more control over the support and care for their own people. Small Supports, certainly in my eyes, and we may hopefully in Simon's as well, because then we can agree, will kind of have a future as well. But let's start with a few kind of looking back questions, Simon. So can you just kind of share the story around how Inclusion Glasgow grew from the closure process around Lennox Castle?
Yeah, sure, Nick. And you know, whenever anybody says, where did something start? Immediately you think, oh yeah, but before that, there was this thing. And I mean, for me, there was a day where I'd been in the States for a year doing something called a Harkness Fellowship. I arrived in Scotland with my wife, who had family there, and I was looking for a job. And I turned up at Lennox Castle Hospital, and there was John Dalrymple and another really important leader, Julie Murray, who were the social care and health leaders of the hospital closure program. And they said, I said, oh, I really want a job helping to close hospitals. That was kind of what in my head would be the logical thing for me to do next. And John said, well, sorry, Simon, you've missed all those jobs. But what we really need is a service provider to actually support people when they got out. And that led through a series of months to me developing the business case for what became Inclusion Glasgow, which was initially designed as a kind of brokerage type organization. So the idea was more that we were going to create supports in the community. And then as we started to get people out, then Inclusion Glasgow really ended up being just a new type of support provider. But do you mind, Nick, if I say a little bit about why, like, the small supports idea, in a way, was already in my head then, for reasons that go back further in time.
Yeah.
And some of this can't be divorced from, I mean, this year we lost, for me, the great hero of all of this movement was John O'Brien. John O'Brien, if people don't know him, was a great American advocate, thinker, really defined the ideas behind inclusion. And I was lucky enough in 1992 to go to Madison, Wisconsin, which was one of the places that had really listened to John for a long time, right through from the late 70s, right through the 80s. And it had developed models that I think we would recognize as small supports then in the 1980s, partnerships between community organizations, the state government and the county government, which is kind of some, yeah, well, let's not get into the complexities of American systems, but you know, together they'd said, right, what we do need is to replace the institutions, is we need small human-sized organizations. There's particularly one organization called Options. I think it was Options for Community Living, but Options is how it was known. You know, and going there in 1992 and having already heard the kind of values of inclusion from John and from it was just so inspiring, Nick. So you were, just met people with learning disabilities who'd been in the institutions, who were living their own lives in exactly the way you would hope, and people were able to articulate what it was all about in a way that I wasn't seeing back at the time I was working in London with a really good organisation called Southwark Consortium. But the level of empowerment, flexibility, community connection that I was seeing in Madison seemed to me the goal. And so I went back to London and started trying to do those kind of things. And actually in London at that time, we were Rob Gregg, who went on to run the Valuing People programme and the NDTI. He'd overseen a kind of strategy. He walked away actually before it was all implemented, but the strategy was to create a kind of commissioning organisation in the voluntary sector, which is what the consortium was. All stuff that's now kind of long forgotten, but very interesting. Like the money would be managed by us, and we'd be supporting the development of small community organisations.
Yeah.
And that was the model we were doing. So we created a handful of organisations in Southwark actually at that time. Interesting again, sorry for that. Like in about 1996, the local authority took control and said, no, we're not allowing this kind of approach. We need a market. How toxic all this was. We need a market. And so we need to be in control. We can't have Southwark Consortium having all this power. And immediately all the small organisations scurried back into Southwark Consortium, thereby killing the market. And then that organisation became Choice Support, which has gone on to have a very positive role in particularly in England. But all of that baggage was in that initial conversation, in all that work we did in London. All of those inspirations from Madison were in those kind of conversations with John and Julie in Scotland.
Well, I think there's something really, really strong, especially if I'm talking to local commissioners about small supports, explaining the story about their roots and the length of time that's gone, that some of them have been around, that are our partners, Sea Change, which grew from Inclusion Glasgow, for example. It's a very different story from kind of presenting something, oh, this is a new idea that we came up with a couple of years ago. So I think, do you want to just say a bit more about why small? I mean, you also use the phrase human-sized.
Yeah, so I think there were two things, at least in my head, that seemed really important about small. I mean, I'm sure there are many others, but one was, I mean, in a way we didn't really, this was stronger in Madison than we have achieved in Glasgow. The paradox in Glasgow was that we were supporting people at the institution, and we said, you can live wherever you want to live. So, of course, we didn't get the value that you get if the small was actually rooted in a place, to be frank. So that part of small, which we actually did a bit better in London, that bit of small, Inclusion Glasgow didn't get. But the other bit that was really valuable, and to me, pretty fundamental from my experiences of the way in which systems and services are working, is basically it's about quality. It's about the relationships that allow you to make sure things are going well. I reckon, like, I think some people actually can do better than me, but in my head, I couldn't imagine understanding what's going on for more than about 30, 40, 50 people. And I don't want to turn that into some kind of hard and fast rule. But I think at some level, if your job is to make sure everything's going well, then don't build yourself an infrastructure that means you can't possibly answer that question.
Yeah.
The only way of answering that question at a certain scale is either actually a kind of very different management structure, which I think is also possible, or bureaucracy, which is usually where people go. And once you get bureaucracy, you actually undo a lot of the good work that you started to do. And so it's that I'm kind of intrigued by small, large, networked, all of these things. I think are there's perhaps a lot of wriggle room in them. But I do think you can't, like, somebody's got to kind of care and keep their eye and have a relationship.
Yeah.
which isn't just the people who care immediately around people, which actually is where all the goodness is really going on. But you still need this secondary kind of check and balance.
Yeah,
and when that's bureaucracy, CQC, regulations, oh, we've got a policy for that,
yeah.
it starts dying.
Yeah, but I think the word that you were using, and it's the word that we champion when we're talking about small supports now, is relationships.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that we can talk about, I can talk about Sam, and she knows every person that's supported by Sea Change, or I can talk about Dave up at Positive Support for You in Middlesbrough. He knows every single person. He knows, and what I loved was, my digression was, I was in Leeds meeting the two new small supports organisations there. And I love the fact that they were doing exactly the same as what Doreen down in Plymouth, or Sam in Glasgow, or Dave in Middlesbrough. They do the same thing. So it's one of these lasting things. Is the director or the boss is the first person to meet the person who's moving out of hospital. So from the moment of first contact, the relationship is there. And it's when you end up with an organisation where that's not happening, where the director doesn't know the people the organisation is supporting, then there's a remove, and the centrality of relationships changes, and it's not the kind of relationships that we would be championing as small supports.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. Yeah.
I actually met and interviewed somebody you'll know, Hughie McIntyre, a few years ago.
Yeah.
And his I had some help from John with translation, because even though I've lived in Glasgow, it wasn't my translation skills weren't that good. But I'm just interested in you sharing maybe some memories or stories about the first few people that you supported at Inclusion Glasgow, and maybe a bit about what you learned, or what it meant for them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the very first family we supported, I do tell the story quite often because it was very important to my learning and to everything that happened left. But this actually wasn't their name. I just called them the Smith family because to protect their privacy. But the Smith family were in a very difficult place. They had two sons, both with mucopolysaccharidosis, which is a horrible chromosomal condition which leads to early death, progressive disability, challenging behavior, but I think just the behavior becomes part of the condition. And they were living in a 2-bedroom flat where they had another son, so a family of 5, two with incredibly complex conditions, living in a 2-bedroom flat in Glasgow, appallingly supported by the local authority, appalling relationship with the local authority, and they reached this breaking point, and their sons ended up in actually a kind of modernized version of Lennox Castle Hospital, not the hospital, but it's kind of a wing of it that was in Glasgow, closer to the central Glasgow. And we were kind of set the challenge of getting these young men out of the institution. No, it was very. I do remember this vividly, Nick. I think Julie Murray, who was then she was my ally in making this happen, because it was a health service funded support package. But talking to the social workers and the nurses and everybody involved, they're so dismissive, so misunderstanding of what was possible, so dismissive of the family. And I spent 2 or 3 months just going, can I talk to the family? Oh, no, you don't want to do that. Oh, the mum drinks, or oh, no. And I'm like, oh, but you'll have to set up 2 different kind of units for the boys, and it'll be madly expensive, and you can't do it. People have said that they can do these things, and so, but could I just talk to the family? So, and eventually I managed to talk to the family, and then you hear the story from their point of view, and you realize how badly they've been treated. You realize how severe the crisis is in their lives. And then, in a matter of a few days working with them, and at this point, to be frank, Inclusion Glasgow was me and a checkbook. I had no staff, I had no structures, nothing. And so, of course, that makes you very creative. But listening to them, it was clear that the family needed to be together, but they needed to be together in a completely physically different environment. And they needed support that they had real control over. People they trusted because of stuff that had happened in the past with statutory services. And in fact, we employed for them family members. And we ended up helping them move house, sell their house, and buy a whole new 5-bedroom house quite close to where they came from, close to all their family and friends. And the boys moved back there. Each boy's support package was 1/3 of the cost of the support package in the statutory service, 1/6 of the predicted cost of an individualized package. Of course, that's because love, family, natural support, the right physical environment makes all the difference in the world, but we just can't seem to pay attention to these things. So I think that was very important to everything that Inclusion Glasgow did. The learning that you really needed to pay attention to the real story. You needed to get alongside people and their families and really understand the dynamics, and then work out with them what the best kind of support would look like. Not all of our support packages by a long, and we were supporting people with no family, no friends, no relationships to come out of the institution as well. And in which case you had to start with, like, the two Margarets were both in, like, Francis and I often reflect on this was a key moment for us, because this is not a situation where you could act in any sense like a broker or facilitator or just, you had to employ some folk, and you had to employ really good folk, and you had to make your best calculation, because both Margarets didn't use words, didn't have allies, didn't have advocates. You had to use their best calculation of what relationship is going to work for them. And so so that was, like, if you like, at the other extreme. But then again, we were supporting both Margarets to leave institutions into a flat of their own, with their own support team recruited for, designed with, around them. Now they were coming out at costing a little bit more than the average cost of people in the institutions, which was about 40,000 a year. We were, I mean, these are all 1996 prices. These are all imprinted in my mind, Nick. I can remember lots of details from this period. But yeah, so somewhere, and then there were all sorts of things in between those two kind of extremes, but lots of it was about really paying attention to what kind of life people wanted, what kind of assets people had in their lives, who they had in their lives. Often people who the system would just dismiss as not being relevant actually played an enormous part. And we also designed a lot of these things around this concept of, I now regret the terminology individual service fund, but you sometimes invent this bogus jargon just to kind of make the system feel like you've done something important. So people had what Jimmy and Michael from Dimensions now call my support money, and that was our thing. Like, the money belongs to the person, guys. That was, and like you say, this is a conversation I would have with people as they left the institution. It was also a conversation you'd have with the support team as you're creating. This is Jimmy's money. This is Huey's money.
Yeah.
And of course, that changes the kind of culture, and people start to, I mean, I think we had the odd scallywag staff member very occasionally. I remember one example, and I'm sure there were more than other, but generally people who are joining us on, ordinary working class Glaswegians, honest, hardworking, committed, creative, fantastic folk. And the combination of bringing together, real people with real lived experience of their community, who good values, with people with disabilities who needed advocates and allies in the community, it was very rewarding.
No, there's something about, well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about, relationships, isn't it? They're real relationships. It's not because you can do a certain number of hours on a Friday night. It's, when I'm talking about it, it's like that or support Newcastle United, because who else would you support? But it's that sort of thing. There's something real in between people that brings people together. Anything that stands out as why it worked, not just in terms of it worked because we listened, which is kind of paramount, but the other things and around supporting Inclusion Glasgow, yourself, and support to people. What made for success?
I don't know. I was chatting to Francis recently. I was Francis Brown and John Dalrymple do their own podcast,
Yeah,
Radical
yeah,
Visions podcast, and you know, I mean, I realised actually, it was stupidly, how much Francis already knew when she came to work for me.
right.
So I know it's a bit embarrassing that it had taken me. So there were a lot of skills in the room, some of which were just I didn't even really understand were in the room.
Mm-hmm.
What Francis said I brought, which is probably true, which is probably is a slightly maddening gift, was kind of philosophical logic and a kind of so like for me, like the human rights issues were just like fundamental frameworks. So when you say right, people choose where they live, people choose where they live with, who they live with, it's
Yeah,
their life.
yeah,
All of those frameworks then became kind of the framework around which the design was done.
yeah,
So essentially what we did, Nick, which I think remains, now not unique, but still very radical in the current setting, is we started from human rights.
yeah,
We started from a presumption of citizenship, and then we worked out how from there. Whereas I think most services today start from a service model, even though those service models are actually date back to the poorhouse.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Somehow they've somehow been blessed as, oh well, that's what you do to people,
yeah,
and we just kind of erased that. So we just said, no, that's not what we do. We support people as citizens. So
yeah,
I think that was what I brought, but I didn't. I was very, very lucky, Nick. Like people like Francis Brown just had um, enormous gifts. Emma, who joined us as a young woman, just enormously skilled. So I was very pretty lucky in the people who turned up and wanted to join in this
yeah,
mad endeavor as well. Um, and then, as I say, what you do by approaching the problem solving in a way that's respectful of. So it's not just about listening; it's expecting people's gifts, looking out
yeah,
for those gifts.
right,
I think that, and
yeah,
again, that goes back really to John O'Brien and to the philosophy of inclusion. So again, and I think that's where that gets missed a lot. So yeah, so I kind of kept hold of this pretty firm kind of moral framework, but rooted in rights. But even more important than that was what was handed on through the inclusion movement was just the expectation of giftedness.
yeah,
And that's not just for people with disabilities. Everybody's
yeah,
gifted. And your job
yeah.
is to look out for what that gift is.
And I kind of when I'm planning with folk, it's I know that there's going to be golden nuggets coming out, and I call it the gifts, the strengths there. But I'm looking for those golden nuggets because I know they're going to come, but you have to, yeah, I guess listen. For us in the small supports program now, it's everything is around Article 19 and the right to independent living and to be included. So very much the same kind of core of human rights, and Sam at Sea Change will challenge me if I ever deviate from that. But then she was part of the same kind of community of people taking on Lennox Castle, so it's, the roots are going through there. Looking more ahead, but thinking about all those strengths, which you can see looking back, we can see in the current kind of mindset around small is good, human sized is good. The role of small supports, that kind of focus on good local person-centered support, how does that kind of feature if you're now looking current day or looking ahead?
Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, I might be wrong. I'm kind of all in now, Nick, on one assumption. And that assumption is that the only sustainable future for care. And I think I've gone back to using the word care, which for reasons we can explore if you like, but I think let's say care is through the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, so this is a distinct kind of shape. It's a real thing. Like in Sheffield recently, we went through an exercise with citizens to define, there was no map of neighbourhoods in Sheffield. So we got citizens to define it, and we discovered 147 distinct neighbourhoods, which is also intriguingly a full break in snooker or whatever it's called.
It is indeed at the Crucible, yeah.
Yeah, so that's curious. That was purely accidental, but it's probably God smiling upon our work. So I think that what I've gone through doing the work in Glasgow, through developing the self-directed support architecture that was then kind of applied or misapplied in England and Scotland, has led, and then kind of moving out of that world, not by my choice, but finding myself having to discover new things. I suppose I really ended up exploring both the power of women supporting other women, and then people with mental health problems supporting the other people with other mental health problems. And then we saw what happened during COVID, and all of this leads me back to, like, there is no sustainable way of us caring for each other, which is our basic kind of moral nature, us at our best, caring for each other and caring for the planet, things we really need to do, that doesn't require us to work through a human scale place-based structure called a neighborhood, or in the country you'd call it a village. And maybe there's other language, but you know what I mean. Like, and the thing about, I mean, and this is pretty well attested actually by global work around community development, but it's also pretty commonsensical. You know, when I was doing some work in Barnsley a few years ago for the council, looking at the civic reforms that introduced, the council leader, and quite an inspiring, slightly frightening guy called Steve Houghton, he put it like this. He said, you know, like in 2010, when austerity turned up, he realized, you know, Barnsley were in big trouble. Central governments basically cut local government funding by 40%, and it provides 70-80% of funding to local government. So the cuts are just beyond anything we've ever seen in the modern era, be after World War II. And again, without going down a rabbit hole, you know, how extraordinary that the Conservative austerity coalition could get away with that, but they did. And it's not stopped, it's not been reversed. So care exists in this kind of highly financially impoverished environment. But he said the only way we can get out of this is through, you know, citizens getting involved. And they're not going to get involved. Barnsley's an average size, exactly average size local authority, 250,000 population roughly, I think. They're not going to all turn up at Barnsley Town Hall to volunteer. People will get involved in their own place, in the places that they love and have pride in. And that seems to me entirely correct. I just cannot see, and I met quite a lot of folk in Barnsley, but the logic of it is quite compelling. And you just think about then what we did do during COVID, how, you know, some people might have been running around a city or something trying to help other people, but the most natural, sensible, and useful things to do are in your immediate neighbourhood. And then you look at what self-advocacy groups are doing, Nick, to survive. What they're doing is turning themselves into community development organisations. It's amazing to see how people with disabilities actually, it doesn't take much for them suddenly to realise they've got a lot of power, capacity, strength. So, and really working with the peer support group in Doncaster, PFG, that's been the biggest impact on my life. And they just see like 3,500 people who have over 15 years just transformed their lives, transformed their communities, are transforming public services, pushing back and reforming those services. And that started with Kelly Hicks going, well, what are we going to do about that? Well, you can only do these things properly and sustainably at a human scale. Sorry, that was a kind of baroque response to your question, but that's where
No,
my
but
head is.
yeah, but it's that core. I mean, I went during COVID. I joined up with the Plymouth Octopus group. I think you know Matt.
Yeah,
And I was part of the kind of supporting the different neighbourhoods across Plymouth, and it was a new world to me. I spend my world working around people with really complicated needs, don't really have roots in neighbourhoods, because that's not where my brain's been. But it was amazing watching the neighbourhoods really kind of stand up, and support their people. And I love this feeling of hearing people caring for their own people. And that stuck with me now, thinking about small supports. We're, talking to guys in London. Can we do something based in the community? What happens if we put this idea in front of you and you guys take control and do it? Or we're trying to work out how to make it work around people with dementia, particularly where their dementia's progressed to the point where they are facing residential care. It's there's a feeling around there's something about, and it's a bit that really excites me. There's something about how this can sit in the small supports really fit within an appreciation of neighborhoods, but because there's a group of people within those neighborhoods, whether they're people living on the street, or they're people with dementia, or they're the people with learning disabilities and autism who've been sent off to the other end of the country, where these organizations are going to be crucial. And they don't necessarily exist except when they're provided over very big areas, and then you lose that relationship thing.
yeah. I think it's a very interesting situation we're in as well. So I think the spirit of small sparks is going to be critical to the future. I think what shape things take is very unclear, if we're honest. Like it, and there's a lot of work to be done to just begin to turn the underlying problems go back to, I think, the market reforms that came out of the 1980s. I would just, what I think what the NDT and small supports brilliant because like I often am very naive, right? So I actually thought that what we do in Glasgow was obviously it worked so well for people. We even managed to create several other organizations
Oh yeah.
out of what we did. I just thought that would grow. So I left all of that thinking, oh, that'll all be fantastic, won't it? And it stopped. It didn't grow. And then the same happened with the self-directed support reforms. One of the key elements was this idea that everybody should have their own budget, and that, I knew that if people have their own budget and they have flexibility and control, then it creates such great, enormous opportunities, not just for people, but for support providers to do a better job.
Yeah.
Did support providers want to rush and take it up? No. Did commissioners want to enable them to do that? No. And in fact, that whole part of the whole self-directed support story almost stopped dead. And it's only thanks to people like Chris Watson, who's fought for that commissioners have allowed some growth in that. And now we've got, a good number of local authorities who are at least playing with that. But it's like, it was a fundamental part of what was supposedly government policy, and it was just killed dead by a mixture of factors I won't rehearse here without getting too angry and distracted. So we're now in this interesting place where I think that the questions about what the future for care are looming very, very large. Change of government, this Casey Commission, who knows? I think that's all very poorly framed. But the economic crisis, the sense of crisis within the professional systems itself, the desire for something better, the experience of what can be better, uh, the the environmental crisis. I think these are all creating perfect conditions for a very big change. That's what I believe. And I
Yeah.
think that, then how we find a way of sharing the necessary skills in the way that you guys have been doing and growing the right kind of supporting infrastructure remains part of the work ahead of us. But
Yeah.
what you've been doing and how you've managed to take that forward represents one of the truly hopeful seeds of change for, I think, what is going to have to be a much bigger,
Yeah.
more radical period of change ahead of us.
Yeah. I don't think there's no, yeah, radical as opposed to easy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. I think we could probably talk for hours, and share a good few memories as well. I remember the story that you shared about those two young guys because it was the very first time I met you. It was in 2001. You came to a Bristol Circles Network conference.
Oh yeah.
And it was the first time I'd ever come out of Plymouth and gone to a big conference. So I was a bit like, oh, but I remember that story. We will make sure that we share contact details, websites. Do you just want to say very briefly a little bit about the Citizen Network so people kind of can find out more?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so we set up. It's only changed its name to Citizen Network a few years ago, but actually it started in 2009. It's basically a kind of alternative think tank and social movement. So for the last 15 years, we've been publishing hopeful, radical, based in real experiences, ideas and models and practices that can help transform the world. And we have 6,500 members from around the world. We've got groups, over 300 groups who've joined from around the world as well. We're trying to network citizens who care about citizenship, I guess. And citizenship for us means everybody having equal rights, but also a shared responsibility to make the world a better place. And that's the only sustainable way we can change the world.